As the old saying goes, it's just not an AMD GPU launch without a last-minute price drop. This time around, the RX 7600 was meant to hit the UK market at £289, but the very day before reviews go live, that was cut by £30. But is it enough to make the RX 7600 competitive? That's what we're going to find out in this video. Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and yes, that is correct, the RX 7600 is real. It's been announced today and it is launching at retail tomorrow on May 25th. In the UK, pricing is coming in at £259.99, while over in the US, the MSRP is $269. Firmly targeting 1080p gaming, we're going to take a quick look at the specs before diving into all of our benchmarks, where we're hopefully going to find out exactly how much faster this card is compared to the previous generation. The first thing you need to know is that the RX 7600 is fabbed on TSMC's 6nm node, and it's a monolithic die, so there's no chiplets here, and the use of 6nm is particularly interesting considering the 7900 XT and XTX both used 5nm for the GCDs. We also find 32 compute units here on this Navi 33 silicon, each with one Ray accelerator and a total of 2048 stream processors alongside 64 ROPs. Clock speed is rated at 2625 MHz boost, and then we find a almost identical memory subsystem to the last generation. It's still 8 gigs of G6 over 128-bit interface, but this time the memory is clocked at 18 gigabits per second instead of 14, and that gives total memory bandwidth of 288 gigabytes a second, though there is also 32 megabytes of second-gen Infinity Cache present. We can also see that power draw has actually increased against the RX 6600 with a total board power of 165 watts. For our testing today, we are of course using our regular GPU test system, which has been provided to us by PC Specialist. This is built around Intel's i9-13900KS CPU, paired with the Gigabyte Z790 Gaming X AX motherboard, and we've got 32 gigs of Corsair Dominator Platinum RGB DDR5 memory. In this video, we're also just going to be focusing on the 1080p and the 1440p data, as that is clearly the most relevant for this class of card. However, if you want to see every single one of our charts, including 4K data for some strange reason, then you can find all of that in the written article on kitguru.net, and I'll leave a link to that down in the description. For now though, let's take a look at those 1080p and 1440p benchmarks. Kicking off our game benchmarks then with Assassin's Creed Valhalla. At 1080p, the RX 7600 delivers 89 FPS on average, and that actually puts it dead level with the RTX 3060 Ti. It's also outperforming the RX 6600 by 25% and is even 8% faster than the 6600 XT. 1440p resolution is very playable as well, with an average of 66 FPS. The 7600 has fallen behind the 3060 Ti here, likely due to memory bandwidth constraints, but it is still a good 11% faster than the RX 6600 XT. Performance in Cyberpunk 2077 also exceeded my expectations, with a 79 FPS average at 1080p Ultra settings. Again, that is just 4% below the 3060 Ti, while outstripping the 6600 XT by a 13% margin. 1440p is relatively playable too, with an average of exactly 50 FPS, and that translates to a pretty decent 41% lead over the RX 6600 and an 18% uplift versus the 6600 XT. The RX 7600 can't keep pace with the RTX 3060 Ti quite so well when it comes to days gone. Even with 98 FPS on average, it's 22% slower than the Nvidia GPU. We can also see only minimal improvements over the RX 6600 XT and Nvidia's RTX 3060 12GB. Again, we are still getting a pretty good experience at 1440p, where it's 25% faster than the RX 6600, but then just 4% ahead of the 6600 XT. The RX 7600 delivers more solid results in Dying Light 2, where at 1080p its average of 79 FPS translates to a 7% lead over the 6600 XT, and it's also 20% faster than the RTX 3060. 1440p sees the gap between the 7600 and the 6600 XT shrink to just a 6% margin, while the RTX 3060 also catches up somewhat, with the 7600 now 15% faster compared to the 20% lead it held at 1080p. Next up is God of War, and this game showed us some pretty awful scaling for the RTX 4060 Ti, so AMD's RX 7600 is actually within 4% of Nvidia's new GPU. Not bad considering it's also over £100 cheaper. It does fall off slightly at 1440p, now coming in 10% slower than the 4060 Ti, but that is still an excellent result for the 7600, and it's very playable at a near locked 60 FPS. Up next is Horizon Zero Dawn, a now slightly older game that runs very well on a lot of hardware. We're getting over 100 FPS at 1080p maximum settings, and that's a 31% uplift versus the RX 6600. 1440p is no problem either. The 7600 is 32% faster than the 6600 here, while coming in 10% ahead of the 6600 XT, though it's also not massively faster than the RTX 3060. If you do want to do some web slinging though, the RX 7600 provides a smooth 81 FPS at 1080p in Spider-Man Remastered, delivering a not insignificant 38% uplift versus the 6600 XT, though it doesn't hold much of a lead over the RTX 3060. At 1440p, performance is still reasonable though, coming in just a touch behind Intel's A770, while we can also note a 14% gain versus the RX 6600 XT. Now, moving on, A Plague Tale Requiem is a stern test for any GPU, and the RX 7600 is reduced to just 52 FPS at 1080p ultra settings. That again puts it level with Intel's A770, although it does have slightly better 1% lows. At 1440p, however, I would personally be looking to lower the settings, as an average frame rate of just 30 FPS is delivered, although that is actually a solid 38% improvement over the RX 6600. Red Dead Redemption 2 is next, and this is a best case scenario for the RX 7600. It scales incredibly well here against the competition, beating out the 3060 Ti by a 7% margin, and it's only just behind the RTX 3070, which is really impressive stuff considering the price point. The 7600 can't quite maintain that level as we step up to 1440p, however, it is still very impressive, but now holds just a 1% margin over the 3060 Ti, with reduced performance likely as a result of the limited memory bandwidth that is more of a factor at higher resolutions. Resident Evil Village continues the impressive scaling though, with the RX 7600 once more within touching distance of the more expensive 3060 Ti. It's also delivering 32% more performance than the RX 6600. 1440p also sees the 7600 still delivering over 115 FPS, where it's now a hair faster than the A770. Gains also come in at 10% versus the 6600 XT. Total War Warhammer 3 delivers more solid results. The 7600 is bringing its biggest gains over the RX 6600 here to the tune of 45% at 1080p, which is a pretty impressive gen-on-gen uplift. At 1440p, however, AMD GPUs seem to struggle a bit more with the 1% lows, but we are still looking at a 19% upgrade versus the RX 6600 XT. Finishing up the game benchmarks then, we have Uncharted 4, where at maximum settings we're getting an average of 106 FPS. That is though a smaller 20% uplift over the RX 6600, though on the flip side, coming in just 10% slower than the 3060 Ti is not a bad result. And then up at 1440p, we're now looking at a 24% gain over the RX 6600, or a 6% lead over the 6600 XT. Overall then, across the 12 games tested, AMD's RX 7600 delivers a 91 FPS average frame rate, and that makes it a 31% improvement versus the RX 6600. It's also only just 10% slower than the RTX 3060 Ti, but 10% faster than the RX 6600 XT. Now, reduced memory bandwidth does see the 7600 fall away from the 3060 Ti slightly as we step up in resolution, as it is now 13% slower on average at 1440p. That is still a decent 33% uplift over the 6600, or an 11% lead compared to the RX 6600 XT. As for what all of that means for value then, based on the $259.99 MSRP, the RX 7600 is the best value GPU we've tested. It offers an 18% reduction in cost per frame against its closest challenger, the RTX 4060 Ti, while it also offers 28% better value than the RX 6600 XT and 34% better value than the 6600. Of course, a lot of AMD GPUs are now selling well under MSRP, and this data based on current retail prices I think is more useful. With the RX 6600 now retailing at just £200, the value proposition of both of those GPUs is effectively identical. The RX 6600 XT is getting harder to find, but 6650 XTs, not shown here on this chart, they will however be knocking right on the door in terms of value, as those GPUs now start at just below £250. Moving on then, it's time to look at ray tracing performance, and we're starting off in Control, focusing on the 1080p data. The RX 7600 is less impressive here, coming in a touch slower than the RTX 3060 with an average of 52 FPS. Now, it is still a hefty upgrade over the 6600, delivering frame rates that are 40% higher, but Nvidia's last gen offering is still superior. The same can be said for Cyberpunk 2077. At 1080p ultra ray tracing settings, the RX 7600 just can't deliver a playable frame rate. In fact, not even the 6700 XT can, with the RTX 3060 coming in faster than both of those AMD GPUs. F122 is slightly less demanding, however, with the RX 7600 capable of a 60 FPS average frame rate with every ray tracing setting enabled, and that puts it on par with the Intel A770, while it also comes in 13% faster than the 6600 XT. Hitman 3 is another example of a game that is just too heavy for the 7600 to run using maximum ray tracing settings. It falters to just 25 FPS on average, so you definitely want to reduce some settings or enable FSR. Spider-Man Remastered is usually pretty amenable to AMD GPUs when enabling ray tracing, but the 7600 again is still struggling, and it's comprehensively outmuscled by the last gen RTX 3060 with noticeably choppier 1% lows than that Nvidia GPU. Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition then finishes off our ray tracing benchmarks on a more positive note, with the 7600 delivering an almost locked 60 FPS with particularly smooth 1% lows. It's a huge 53% faster than the RX 6600, and it comes in 22% ahead of the 6600 XT. Over those 6 games then, on average, the RX 7600 is certainly a much better ray tracing GPU than its predecessors, delivering 20% better performance on average compared to the 6600 XT. It is still no match for Nvidia here, however, coming in 8% slower than the RTX 3060, and if you remember, it was just 10% slower than the 3060 Ti for rasterization. Well, now it's 30% behind when looking at ray trace games. Switching direction for now though, it's time to take a look at AMD's new reference card before running it through our thermal and acoustic tests. Straight away, the design language is very reminiscent of the 7900 XT or XTX. If you imagine those cards but with one of the 3 fans simply locked off, well, you basically have the 7600. That means it is a premium design overall with a hefty metal shroud, although it's not actually that heavy, weighing in at 750 grams on my scales. It's also pretty dinky in terms of its dimensions, measuring in at approximately 205mm long, 115mm tall, and then it's a standard dual slot thickness. Those two fans we can see positioned within the shroud as well, they measure 80mm in diameter, and there's also a stealthy black metal backplate. Power then comes from a single 8-pin connector, and the reference card offers 3 DisplayPort 2.1 and 1 HDMI 2.1 ports, though do be aware some AIB models may only ship with DisplayPort 1.4 instead of DisplayPort 2.1. Now, I do actually have a Sapphire Pulse card here, and I am going to be working on a review, but for the thermal performance right now, I don't have any current comparisons. The reference design is still more than a match for the Navi 33 Silicon, however, with the GPU peaking at 71 degrees, while the hotspot came in 20 degrees warmer at a peak of 91°C, but that is still well within safe limits. Noise levels are not a problem either, it has to be said. My testing saw those two fans running at 54% or about 1650 RPM over our 30-minute stress test, and that resulted in noise levels hitting 36 decibels. I did, however, notice some coil whine during my testing, but this was typically only in the in-game menus. During actual gameplay, it simply wasn't a problem, but here's a quick sound test. Moving on then, we can also take a quick look at the clock speed behaviour, and this is very tight overall, with only very small fluctuations to the GPU frequency in my testing. We saw the RX 7600 reference average a frequency of 2552 MHz across the 30-minute stress test. And now it's time to come on to power draw, and here we're looking at power draw of just the graphics card measured using Nvidia's PCAT tool. AMD rates the RX 7600 with a 160 watt TBP or total board power, and that is almost exactly what I found in my own testing. Over the 12 games I benchmarked, 1080p power draw averaged 160.9 watts. While that is still undeniably low in objective terms, it is actually slightly more than what the 4060 Ti consumes, and that GPU is a fair bit faster overall, so it'll be interesting to see how the efficiency figures stack up. At 1440p as well, average power draw is broadly the same as it was at 1080p, with a new average of 161.5 watts. Combine that power draw then with the performance on offer from the RX 7600, and we can see efficiency levels here just don't move the needle forward from an AMD perspective. While that 160 watt power draw is still low, it's a fair bit higher than what was offered by the RX 6600, and that results in an efficiency gain of just 4% for the RDNA 3 GPU. It's actually still less efficient than the RX 6800 despite being a newer architecture, and it's clearly no match for the RTX 4060 Ti, delivering 28% lower performance per watt. As expected, relative efficiency of the RX 7600 gets worse at 1440p too, as the card's gaming performance drops off here, but power draw remains constant. We can see it's now level with the RX 6900 XT and still well behind the Ada Lovelace GPUs. So that is going to do it for all of our testing then, and it's time to bring this one into land with my closing thoughts on the RX 7600. In all honesty guys, it is pretty meh. I don't think it's as objectively bad as the RTX 4060 Ti that we saw yesterday, but it's hardly an exciting launch. I think mainly for the most part because AMD has really stolen its own thunder with all of these RDNA 2 deals that are going on at the moment, but more on that in just a moment. As a direct successor to the RX 6600, the performance uplift comes in at around 31% on average for 1080p gaming, and it's also 10% faster than the more expensive 6600 XT. Again, these are not major gains, but I think considering some of the other products that have launched this generation, it's relatively okay. Ray tracing also scales slightly higher thanks to the improvements found within the RDNA 3 architecture. We're talking performance uplift in the region of 41% over the 6600 compared to the 31% gains we saw in rasterization. However, the overall performance is still lagging behind compared to Nvidia. Even today, the RX 7600 is actually slower than the RTX 3060 12GB for ray tracing, so it's safe to say you won't be enabling RT Ultra settings in every single game. It's definitely worth talking about the VRAM situation as well, as this was obviously a major issue for us when we reviewed the 4060 Ti that went live yesterday. And considering the 7600 has the same capacity over the same 128-bit memory interface, you are probably thinking it's just as big of a problem. Now, I absolutely stand by the comments I made in my review yesterday. If you want an uncompromised max setting gaming experience, an 8GB card is simply going to give you issues today and into the future. I don't, however, see this as much of a significant issue for the 7600 as I do for the 4060 Ti, and that is for one key reason: price. I simply think if you spent £260 on your graphics card, you are going to be much more willing to compromise image quality than you would if you'd spent almost £400 on the 4060 Ti. I do, however, still think that 12 gigs on a 7600 class GPU would be ideal. And again, I'm not defending AMD here at all, but you can understand the decision a lot more with the 7600 than you can for the 4060 Ti. That's only the case, however, until we bring in the RDNA 2 GPUs that are now on sale across the board. Over the last few days, I've seen RX 6600s on sale for just £200, and the 6650 is currently less than £250 here in the UK. At those prices, being completely honest, I do struggle to see a clear reason why you would opt for the 7600 instead of a last gen offering. Take the RX 6600 for instance. That is still a very solid GPU for 1080p high settings gameplay, and if you've only spent £200 on your graphics card, you're going to be even more willing to accept image quality compromises than you would if you'd spent $260 on the RX 7600. I also have to say that the RX 6700 10GB looks a particularly interesting option at around $280 in the US, though it just unfortunately doesn't seem to be in stock anywhere on this side of the Atlantic. Now, I would usually point to an improvement in power efficiency as a potential reason to upgrade, but the unfortunate reality is we just don't get that with the 7600, as its overall efficiency is actually within 4% of the RX 6600 XT. In other words, the performance uplift over the 6600 is roughly matched by the increase in power draw, so it definitely looks like AMD's decision to go for the 6nm process node hasn't led to any improvements to power efficiency, and that is a definite shame. Overall then, like I said, the 7600 is pretty meh. I do think the last minute price drop from $289 down to $259 has given it just enough that it's not absolutely atrocious, but if you are looking for a new 1080p class GPU, I really can't see a clear reason to go for this instead of a last gen offering, considering the sheer value you are getting from those GPUs as they are on sale across the board. I think if AMD were to cut the price of the 7600 again by maybe another £25 to £30, then things would really start to look competitive for this new RDNA 3 GPU, but with RDNA 2 GPUs still lining the shelves, I'm really not sure when that might happen. Anyway guys, that is going to do it for this review. If you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up, and as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. While you're there, you can also check out a link in the description to our Discord server where we'd love to chat with you guys, and you can also find links to our brand new merch store, and you could even consider backing us on Patreon. That's it for this one though guys. I'm Dominic for Kit Guru. I'll see you in the next video.